Well, I guess you would have had to have been there. If after the telling of a story you have to say that, I'm guessing that the telling of the story did not go exactly as planned. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. Thank you for joining me today for a weekly word of Torah. Now, it should be no great surprise if after telling that story about that thing that we just had to let someone know about that happened last Friday night at that crazy thing that we went to and that wild and crazy person who was there who we all know, if the reaction we get is not the same feeling that we had, no surprise there, because in order to get to that moment where that wild and crazy thing happened by that wild and crazy person, we had been preparing for that through what we put in our bodies, through our interactions with each other, the places we went, the music we were listening to, the sounds, the smells, everything all around us. And the person we're telling the story to cannot have the same reaction because they weren't part of that. At best, if that's someone who is usually with us and that thing that happened has happened over and over again, then at least there is some context. But without that, there's no context. There's complete collapse of what we've experienced when we try to place that into someone else's consciousness. And indeed, context collapse is now a terminus technicus. It's a technical term. It evolved out of the 80s and 90s through psychologists and sociologists, and then communications experts in the aughts and the teens started using this more formally to describe either one deliberately or accidentally on social media posts something where those that are viewing it either, again, because it's deliberate or accidentally done, cannot and do not understand the context and then take it as something that it's not meant to be. This would be like posting the video of a burning building to say how evil this group was that caused this building to burn when the video was from a different part of the world 5 years previous. But more recently, the term has become more broadly used, and I like this context because I think that it starts moving us to something that truly is universal experience. And I've seen recently the concept of context collapse used with comedians where 2 minutes of their sets have been then placed on the internet, and the context is the audience that was there who chose to be in that place. The collapse is when all the world audiences become the audience of those 2 minutes. However, the rest of the world audience wasn't there and were not the context of that first moment. I'm not going to argue whether what was said was offensive or not, but I'm saying that the experience of being in the audience, like that thing that happened that wild and crazy Friday night, anything where you try to elicit a reaction based on something that we haven't seen the larger context of it falls into this category. I'm actually happy about the generalization of this term because I think that it starts tying into some archetypal and universal sorts of things that we can discuss. I had a composition professor once who said that they refused to listen to recordings of live performances. I wanted them to hear something that I found beloved. And they said no, because I need to be in the context of the performance. That was actually the word they used. I'm not trying to overuse that word to make a point. What they described to me was a great truth. When you're in the audience, you've got the obvious things. You don't know the nuances that are going to be different from a different performance. If you just look at a score of a symphony, that is not what the musical experience is. This is obvious. It doesn't even need to be talked about. But it's more than that. If you listen to a Deutsche Grammophon recording of Rachmaninoff 2, you know a few things. 1, it is going to be a great artist. 2, it's going to be a great symphony. 3, the performance is going to be a great performance. Otherwise, it wouldn't be on the label. But that's not the experience. Even great performers have off nights, and part of the tension, not that we would ever want a great performer to have an off night, but part of the tension of being there live is not knowing when you're sitting there what's going to happen. If a mobile phone is going to go off, if Zubin Mehta is going to turn around and throw the baton at the person that happened to, if the person who's sitting in front of you is going to spend 7.5 minutes unrolling the cough drop wrapper when they should have done that before the concert started. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. There is a tension to not knowing what happens next. That is the tension that makes life. The recording takes away that tension, takes away what it actually means to live life. Part of a collapse of context is the collapse of the experience of life itself. Let me give a completely different example. If you were to watch Free Solo, one of my favorite documentaries, after you watched Alex Honnold, the person who's the subject of the documentary, his TED Talk, then spoiler alert, then you will know that he survived the free solo of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. So first of all, wonderful, thank goodness. amazing. My fingers hurt just as I start thinking about it. That's part of my context of the experience. But there's a part in the video where he gets to the crux, the part of the climb where he has to do a move that he calls the karate kick. And he's failed multiple times under rope as he's been planning for this. And all of the camera people are his friends, not just colleagues. They're people that care about him, care about his welfare. And one of the people with a massive camera on the ground, he can't watch. His context of the situation is watching for 2 years the preparation for this, watching a part of the climb that he knows that his friend has failed on before, and then the context of relationship, the context of friendship. If we're watching the video not knowing what happens, that's a different context than if we watch it knowing what happens, but we still, even with all the emotions that we have, are not having the experience of the climber, of course, but certainly the experience of the people who love him, who were there as that happened. Life involves tension. Life involves the unknown, but life involves being present in our own lives. And unfortunately, when you tell a story or you give someone a tiny bit of the larger sliver of experience, as we're telling it, we have the curse of knowledge. We know what happened and we are tied to all the emotions that are present and were present. But the person we're saying it to, well, we're assuming they're going to get the whole picture. They can't get the whole picture. It's not possible. But their reaction at best is going to be, okay, let me tie that into all the things that I know, and I will be gentle in my judgment and my understanding of all this. But when we tell these stories, sometimes what happens instead is the person listening grabs to their worst fears and their experience of our story. Their experience of the tiny decontextualized snippet is a really brutal and negative reaction. That's why I think the Parsha this week is so important. We're in Shalach, and the first part of the narrative is the very famous narrative of the 12 spies that are sent off into the promised land in order to look at the land. And the story contains 4 context collapses, 1 theological, 3 oh-so-real, practical, understandable, universal experiences. And over the course of all 4 of them, they fold into each other to then create a snowballing effect of negativity that leads us to some profound and great practical as well as theological truths. The first context collapse is the collapse from the context of universal wisdom to human finite perspectives. The eternal self says to Moses, this is a good land. You can go there. You will be able to conquer this land. Now, regardless of what we think about words such as conquer, we need to look at the narrative here and not our decontextualized experiences of such words right now. This is a universal archetypal story. It's not just about our feelings. But even in this story, Moses, the greatest of all prophets, according to Jewish tradition, he cannot accept the context of universal wisdom, of knowledge, of universal hope. When he, through his prophetic connection with that which is greater than him, understands that this land is a good land that we can go into, what he does instead is, let's go and check it out in advance. Now, it could be seen as a lack of faith, as some commentators comment on, or it could be seen as Moses being a good leader saying, well, I sure as well know what I've heard. It doesn't mean that Plony ben Plony is going to trust me on this one, so let's go ahead and satisfy the crowd. Regardless, there is a loss when we go from the universal to the finite. Moses represents the beginning of finite in our narrative, and so therefore this assuredness is not passed on. This leads us to the next 3, which feel an awful lot like life today when we look at them at the symbolic level. And it's what happens when we see a tiny, finite part of reality, any reality, a land, a people, a person, a household, and we make universal judgments and emotional decisions based on thinking that we've seen the full picture. The 12 spies, one representative from each of the 12 tribes, are told to go out, and they have very specific orders. We need to find out about the land. Is it good or bad? What kind of soil is it? Are there trees? We need to find out if there are good crops there. As a matter of fact, if you can, bring something back. We need to find out about the people. Are they mighty? Are they great? Are they warrior-like? Or are they small and not very numerous? We need to find out about the cities. Are they open camps or are they fortified cities? And according to the archaeological record, at that time, there would have been fortified cities. So the spies go out for 40 days, and the first collapse of context is them viewing something they don't know. They don't have the context for. They've been in Egypt in the narrative. Now they've been wandering in the desert to get to the border of the land that is their promised land, and they don't know this land. They don't know the people, and just these broad categories of open cities or walled cities, good earth, bad earth, big people, small people. If you were to camp out from someone's house for 40 days without binoculars, let's say you're maybe a kilometer distant, how much are you going to know about the nature of the human being who is living in that house? You can get some general ideas. You can make some inferences based on what kind of car they drive and how often they leave their house. You can get some sort of idea of what sorts of hours they keep. But does that tell you about the inner human being, their mercy, their kindness, their cruelty, their capacity for evil, their capacity for brilliant goodness? So what, we're going to go back and then tell someone who's responsible for making life and death decisions what we know of them based on what car they drive and how often they leave their house and that they go to bed every day at 2 a.m? I can make some inferences, but I don't know who they are. And this first collapse is the collapse of believing that we can make accurate report of someone through a limited, distant viewing of who they are. The second collapse is among the 12 spies themselves. All human beings are going to have their own personal hopes and fears that they bring to the experience, and that's exactly what we see. In this version of the narrative, there's another one in Deuteronomy where both Joshua and Caleb are the good guys. In this one, it's only Caleb to begin with. So the 12 spies report together, and they say, yes, look at this big, fat, juicy bunch of grapes. Indeed, there are good crops there. The land is good. But also the people seem to be mighty and numerous, and the cities are fortified and not open camps. That's the report. But something in Caleb hears or understands how that's going to be taken, that that's not enough to give even the limited picture that he has to the people. And so he says, but we can do it. He has that cheerleader moment. The person in every organization is like, we can do it, to balance the person in every organization who says, we can't do that. And what happens? The second collapse. When the vision that Caleb has, his specific understanding from his limited understanding of what happened in Canaan, when he gives that, then the other 11, they go a little crazy because they've already given their objective report. Now watch what happens. We started with, yeah, there's problems to be looked at, but listen to how quickly this spirals. Starting in verse 32, thus they, meaning the spies, spread calamities among the Israelites about the land they had scouted, saying, so this is not objective reporting now. Quote, the country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. All the people that we saw in it are of great size. We saw Nephilim there. Okay, giants from of old. The Anakites are part of the Nephilim, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. And so we must have looked to them. Right? Caleb's words and the thought that because of that, they might actually be going out into this unknown, frightening situation. And then all of a sudden, the dominant experience they have is not of even the objective, limited view they've had. It becomes only about the voices inside themselves of what they cannot do. Step 4, the rest of the people, us, we hear. So we hear one person's voice saying, we can do it. That's not loud enough when you've got 11 shouting, we were like grasshoppers to these great people. And then what happens? Well, it should be expected. Everyone freaks out. 11 people become thousands of people. And the result is we were not allowed to enter the promised land. 40 years we had to wander until the entire generation, other than Caleb and Joshua, who eventually said, no, Caleb's right, we can do it. Until all the people who reacted so predictably and humanly were no longer there, until the next generation had the opportunity to see things a different way. We could not step over that border into the new promises. Now, there's enough here that we don't really even need to go much further. This is enough for us to be able to think about as well how we relate to each of these sorts of things. But since the idea of context collapse specifically was coined to deal with social media, let's just finish off by the way that we send our spies out every day to see a limited reality. And again, this is something that most people are going to say, I already know that. I want us to still think about this for a second. Because one of the ways that many of you out there right now, if you've made it this far in the video, are experiencing anxiety is going through your friends and neighbors and acquaintances and person you've met once in your life that you have their Instagram feed, or we can easily have the feed of celebrities. And our life isn't as good as the people that we see. No one's life that is flipping through an Instagram feed, or pick your social media, I don't really care, is as good as the person that you're seeing. Every frame you see is a collapse of context. Everything you see contains a snippet of a moment decontextualized from the soul of the person who's done it. The person who looks very happy on the beach of Majorca may be the most miserable person on the face of this planet. We have no way of knowing, but yet our complete self-evaluation, the depression and anxiety of so many people, is based on our experience of looking at these decontextualized people as we go through their feeds. And unfortunately, as we spend time dwelling on that one frame where we're asking the questions on why not me, well, the long dwelling on that frame is exactly where Moloch, the algorithm, wants us to be. And the thoughts going in our heads are each of those different levels of context collapse, because we know nothing about what's in that person's mind, what's in that person's heart, what's in that person's soul. Context collapse has put us into a position where we are obsessing about lives that we actually know nothing about, but somehow have the illusion we know everything about, and we fall short. So what do? Let's look at Bamidbar. Let's look at the wilderness, the 40 years of wandering now, at a universal and metaphorical level. The actual message is this: we're stuck. Something is going to happen in all of our lives where we get stuck repeating the same fantasies in our head over and over again until we're able to work through them. That's the idea of 40 years. That's the idea of a generation passing away. When you place this over yourself, when this is a reflection of our individuation, of our actualization, then this becomes the universal story of I'm going to keep on repeating the same patterns of anxiety and depression until I get past them. And in the case of social media, it is until we internalize that if we're flipping through feeds, we have to do it with the complete understanding that that is not us and we cannot know anything about that person. One of the beautiful teachings, the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments, is making sense of that strange last one. You shall not covet anything that your neighbor owns or covet your neighbor themselves. Rabbi Michal of Zolochov suggests that to not covet is not a commandment, it's actually a reward. The spiritual path of Judaism is to start with, I am the eternal your God. This is not the bearded person external to us, but recognition of radical interconnectivity. We are all humans connected to the same greater reality. And once we internalize that, once we have truly apprehended that, the end result of that is, of course, we wouldn't harm anyone profoundly, but the reward at the end of that is we can flip through and see someone that we barely know or even know dearly, who maybe doesn't work as hard as we do, who maybe gets money from relatives that we just don't have that access to. And when they go to Majorca, our experience of that is, I hope they had a good time, because at the end of the day, it's very possible that other than that trip to Majorca, they are miserable. And they desperately need that. It could also be that they are living a very shallow life and they are going to have privileges that I will never have in my life. It still doesn't get to affect how I live my life. It only happens when I give them permission to own me. And right now we've all given Moloch, the algorithm, permission to show us people who own us, to show us people out of our context. Something about every single one of us is enviable to someone else. The purpose of our lives is not to make people envy us. It is to find those things in ourselves and to delve into them and to become the greatest version of ourselves than we can. When we focus on being the healthiest version of ourselves, and I know I'm a self-help book right now, I don't really care, because how many of you out there right now are miserable because of your social media habits and seeing these things that are hurting you so much? Our job is to better ourselves. It is a simple truth. And once that happens, we get out of the wilderness, we cross the boundary, we end up in the promised land. And that promised land that is flowing with milk and honey is our vision of the promised land, what a good life means to us, not what it means to our neighbor who can go to Majorca and lay on the beach. That's not what actualizes us. What actualizes us might be something radically different, that I can finally read the books that I want to read, that I can finally work on that musical instrument, that I can finally develop the relationships that are fulfilling, that I can finally spend the time with my family that I should be, instead of obsessively looking through Instagram feeds. But we're going to finish listening to this message this Sabbath, and we're going to end up on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever our flavor is, and we're going to flip through and we're going to see someone who upsets us. We're going to give some of our energy to someone who looks better than us, who looks healthier than us, who seems happier than we are. We don't have the context. We don't know. Let's stop sending these tiny portions of our greater self out to try to spy on people that we can never know. And let's focus on something slightly more important. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Et amor Yisrael